COVID-19 has been with us for over a year now. And as much as we may believe that people have reached the COVID fatigue phase, many individuals continue to suffer in silence. People are still losing their loved ones, their jobs and livelihoods, and even worse is the fact that the Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, yesterday issued a strong warning that the second year of COVID-19 is set to be far more deadly. Well, here to give us insights on how to stay positive during this period is certified transformational life coach and founder of Positive Minds Africa, Tracey Dube. Tracey Dube, good to have you join us. Thank you for joining us. Well,
Thank you for having me.
Let's start by asking you, many people seem to have reached this COVID fatigue phase, especially with renewed lockdown measures. How can people stay positive in these times?
It's very important to stay positive during this tough period, especially because COVID is something so unique. We have never experienced it before. So, when first we were hit by COVID, most of us didn't think it would last this long. Now it is a year and a few months later, and we are here. And so we have experienced and continue to experience different emotions at different stages of our lives. When the infection rates go down, we feel positive. And when you lose a loved one, you feel negative and you feel down. So the emotions have just been up and down. But what's important and what's essential is to remain hopeful. Remain hopeful, as negative emotions tend to release stress-related hormones in our bodies, and that affects our mental health. So studies show that by staying positive, we are able to reduce our chances of suffering from depression and other mental illnesses.
Understood. Thank you very much for that, Tracey. Naturally, as you've just mentioned there, apart from COVID-19 obviously placing an immediate risk to our physical health, there's also the effect it has on our mental health. There's an example of a British Nigerian a young person called Richard Okorogaya who went missing for some time last month, I believe it was, and unfortunately was found dead a short time later. And it was believed that when he initially went missing, there were reports that he, as a sickle cell patient, was struggling with shielding, obviously keeping himself indoors and protecting himself from the risks of going outside and perhaps becoming infected with COVID-19. For people who may be in similar situations, how do you suggest they continue to keep a positive mind and protect their mental health at a time like this?
Good question. So you have to be, by remaining positive, you have to be intentional and deliberate about it, because our brain normally, it's naturally wired to go into the worst case scenario. So when you are going through a challenging situation, your brain will automatically default to getting you into survival mode. So for instance, hypothetically speaking, if someone has experienced a job loss, for example, your brain will start stressing about, how am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to pay for my child's school fees? How am I going to pay for my medical aid? And all of these things will work in your head. And the first step is to acknowledge the situation, acknowledge your feelings, because these questions are valid and demand your attention. Running away from our feelings, they do not make them go away. So if you run away from your feelings, it only magnifies the problem. So face your feelings and challenge yourself with these questions. Then begin to take a step towards reframing your thinking about the situation. So looking for possibilities, so looking at the situation in a realistic but hopeful way. That involves looking for possibilities. It involves asking yourself better questions. For example, with the job situation, for instance, you could say, well, what if I do get a job within the next month or two? Or can I go and make a payment plan with my bank, with my tenant? Can I go to my child's school and make some sort of arrangement? When you do this, your brain begins to expand other possibilities instead of being limited to the problem and the situation that is in front of you. So allow yourself to think of creatively, think of possibilities, and get yourself in that mind frame. And I always tell people that pretend as if your friend were standing in front of you and telling you the problem that they have. What advice would you give them? Would you say, "Oh, my friend, this is terrible, it's the end of the world"? Or would you use encouraging words to lift them up, being realistic but hopeful at the same time? And what I mean by being realistic and hopeful is to say, okay, this is the situation that I'm finding myself in, but let's look at what are other possibilities? What are other things that I could try out? Back to the job thing, maybe you could say, I might be in the situation, but I'm applying every day. So one day I will get a response for an interview, or, things are getting better, the COVID and the situation is getting better. And those positively putting yourself in that situation will allow you to think of other possibilities.
Well, Tracey, people are still losing their jobs as the pandemic continues to bite. So what coping strategies can be adopted whilst seeking employment?
That's such a good question. Firstly, it's critical to understand that coping is a process and it is not an overnight thing. It's different for everyone. So certain strategies may work for some people and may not work for other people. But in general, I would say try to lean on things that ease your feelings of anxiety, things that lift your spirit up. So it can be prayer for some people, meditation, worship, listening to your favorite music. It can be things like trying out a new hobby, focusing on your breathing, slowly breathing in and out. It could be just taking a walk outside in between your breaks while you are searching and job hunting. In between that, having a routine is also quite important, because when you are in a position where you are unemployed, for example, it's important to have a routine and maintain a routine where you are able to say, from this time, this is what I'm doing. You can get yourself busy with chores. You can exercise. Exercise is actually, I know when you're feeling hopeless, you do not want to think of exercise. But studies continue to show that exercise helps improve your mood, and you have a release of, your brain releases feel-good hormones. And these things are things we take for granted. But, and although they may not necessarily make the problem go away, they are great mechanisms and strategies that you can use while you are going through this period, while you are job hunting, while you're going through grief. They may not make the problem go away, but they are great coping mechanisms. So take advantage of them. And also, it's okay to be okay with not being in control. We cannot control the state of the world. We cannot control the state of the economy. So focus on what you can control. Focus on managing your emotions as best as you can, so that you do not find yourself in your health, your mental health deteriorating to a point where you are depressed. So focus on managing your emotions. But when you start to experience constant feelings of hopelessness, when you start experiencing feelings of guilt and shame and even thoughts of suicide, I would say speak to someone or seek professional help immediately. Don't prolong the process. Don't think that you can do it on your own. As soon as these feelings are constant and you're finding yourself in this deep, dark hole all the time, seek professional help.
Thank you so much for that. As you've said, when you talk about job loss, that's obviously going to attack the way people see themselves, because ultimately a lot of individuals, ourselves included, we tend to measure our self-worth with how we present in society. So naturally, something like a job loss, but even so much as a death in the family, can really trigger emotions that attack the way you see yourself. When we look at grief, that's also been something that's been part and parcel of this pandemic era. I'd imagine that the advice you'd give would be similar to tackling grief that is the advice you just gave in terms of how to mend your mental health after a job loss. But when we are talking about grief specifically, what are ways in which people can continue to improve their mental health despite the mental anguish they're going through?
You know, grief is such an interesting thing because people grieve differently. There are people who focus on, isolating. Normally, when we are grieving or actually experiencing any sort of challenge, the first thing to do is to isolate. So we want to be alone. We want to, grieve alone without anyone around us. And it's common. It is common, but I would advise anyone going through grief or experiencing that terrible stage in their lives, reach out to someone. Reach out to someone that you can talk to. Reach out to a friend, a neighbor, a relative, anyone that you trust. Because when you talk about your issues, when you talk about your feelings, you realize that you're not alone. And sometimes you find yourself coming across people who have gone through a similar experience, someone who is grieving or someone who has just lost a loved one a few months prior, a few years prior, and they will be able to help support you with coping strategies and tools that will build your resilience and help you to find yourself moving away from that dark space. So talk to someone. That is the first thing I would say. And also try to remember the good things about that person as well.
Absolutely, Tracey, it pains me to have to interrupt you here, but it is time for us to take a short break. Tracey is still with us after this break. Please do stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We're still joined by Tracey Dube, who is a coach, a motivational coach, a certified transformational life coach, and she's also the founder of Positive Minds Africa. Tracey, thank you so much for staying with us. You know, before we went on break, I know we were talking about ways that we can protect ourselves from the anguish of grief. And thank you very much for your words on that. But also, we know that one of the ways Positive Minds Africa seeks to help people is through what you call positive psychology. Could you give us some more insight on what that means and how it works?
Positive psychology has been scientifically proven to help you sort of like remove yourself from the point where a negative frame of thinking. So positive psychology encourages an individual to think and expand their minds creatively on what's possible and positive. So instead of finding yourself in this dark hole and just faced with the issue that is in front of you, you are sort of like limited to expand your thinking. And by positive psychology, you shift your thinking by creatively coming up with ways and possibilities in a positive way, notwithstanding what you are going through. You know, like I said earlier, people think by remaining positive, it means that you are constantly happy. It does not mean that. Being positive has nothing to do with being happy. It just means that when you are in a situation that you find yourself in a challenging situation, you are able to move yourself from that situation and creatively think of ways. And this is where life coaches are able to help as well, because they help you, even someone else that you speak to, they're able to help you look at different perspectives. And that is what positive psychology is. And when you look at different perspective, you begin to be hopeful about the future and the situation changing for the better.
And Tracey, how do you help people shift their thinking, their feeling, and their behavior using the transformative coaching theory?
So what that means is, like I said, you know, you walk in with the situation that you have before you, and normally people don't believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. When you find yourself in a challenging situation, you are sort of like restricted to only that. You don't think that there is a way out. And this is why people fall into, you know, depression, or they start stressing out about whatever challenge they are going through. Shifting into a transformative thinking process is being able to say, asking questions that are going to enhance your thinking and your feeling and your action. Because I believe, and it's not even just me, research shows that everything starts in the mind. So you think positive thoughts and they lead into positive speech and they lead into positive actions and results. The same is true when it comes to negative thoughts. When you are constantly finding yourself thinking of negative things, you will think of those negative things constantly in your head, and you will find yourself speaking those negative things. I always make an example that, when you go for an interview, you go for an interview, and after the interview, somebody says, "How did it go?" And you're like, "Oh, it was terrible. It went bad. I'm never going to get that job. I'm not going to get the job." And when you don't get the job, then you're like, "See, I told you, I was never going to get the job. I'm just so unlucky." And you keep saying these bad things. It's because it starts with a thought and it translates to your speech. And once you speak it, it has the power to create. We do not understand the power of our words. And that's why it's so important to constantly fill our minds with being realistic, but being hopeful, because that is going to translate into our speech, and it's going to translate into our actions and our feelings, and ultimately the results that we have.
I'm so happy that you talked about how it translates into our speech, because obviously communication is very important across all tenets of society. But tell us, how can we all be better communicators, be better listeners? What does it take to be a good communicator?
I'm so glad you asked that question. A lot of times people think being a good communicator means that you are able to speak, you are able to think on your feet, you are able to respond, you are good at being conversational and creating these great conversations with people of all walks of life. And it is part of being a good communicator, but being a good communicator is actually being a good listener. It starts with being a good listener. I work with introverts a lot in my line of work, and the first thing they say, "I'm such a bad communicator, but I'm a very, very good listener." And I'm like, well, if you're a very good listener, that is a strength. That is a positive thing about being a good communicator. It starts with being able to listen, to the other person, acknowledging where they come from. I read a lot. So one of my favorite books of all time is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Mm-hmm. And Stephen Covey talks about this, that, when you find yourself in a situation where you listen to another person, understand where they are coming from before you want to be understood. That is being a good communicator. Most of the time, you may find yourself having a conversation with someone, or you know someone who's like this, who, whenever you have a conversation with them, they are ready to respond, they are ready to jump in, they are ready to cut you off. And that is not what being a communicator is about. Listen to the other person with the intention to understand, not with the intention to respond. And then finding yourself in a position where you respond, and always think about win-win. I always say, with conversations, whether it is at work, in relationships, think win-win. Just don't think, how am I going to benefit? What is it that I can say that will put me at an upper hand? No, think win-win in a professional or even in your relationships.
And Tracey, since we're still talking about renewed lockdown measures here, in spite of the availability of vaccines, many countries are going into a third wave of the pandemic. Now, this must be very frustrating. How can we feel optimistic and hopeful about life again?
Like I said earlier, it's so important to be intentional and deliberate, because normally we find ourselves in a situation where we are constantly thinking the worst is still to come. And it may be true, with third wave for many countries being a possibility, you are thinking of the worst. But a lot of the times also they do say that the third wave sometimes may not even necessarily be worse than the second or the previous waves. What is important is to think of the fact that, okay, if I am here a year and a few months later, I have survived a year and a few months later, what are the possibilities that I will survive again? What are the possibilities that those strategies that have carried me through till this moment, whenever I felt anxious, whenever I lost hope, whenever I felt that there was no light at the end of this COVID situation, what are those things that have carried you from the time that we were first hit by COVID? And use those strategies, lean on those things, use them even going forward, because it's quite obvious that COVID is going to be something that will remain with us for some time. And also control whatever it is that you can control within yourself. Like I said, you can control, what you expose yourself to, the places that you go to. You can control washing your hands regularly, taking care of your family.
Well, again, I have to practice all that you have said to us today. Tracey Dube, founder, Positive Minds Africa, and certified transformative life coach. Many thanks for joining us on The Morning Show.